On a Sunday morning in late October, my daughter sent me a text message that changed everything. It said, "Dad, we've decided the cottage closing weekend is just for immediate family. Lorraine thinks it's better that way." The next morning, I removed her name from my will, transferred the lake property back into my sole name, and booked a one-way flight to Victoria. When they arrived at the cottage that Friday, the locks had been changed, the bank account was empty, and there was a sold sign at the end of the driveway. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled the life I had spent 40 years building for my daughter, let me ask you something. Drop a comment below and tell me where you are watching from. And if you have ever given everything to someone who treated your kindness like a weakness, hit like and subscribe. My name is Roger Callahan. I am 67 years old, and I spent 4 decades running a mid-size commercial roofing company out of Hamilton, Ontario. It was a Sunday. The maple trees along my street had already turned, that particular shade of deep red that always reminded me of my late wife June. She passed away 4 years ago, just after our 38th anniversary, and I will be honest with you, the grief never fully leaves. It just changes shape. Some mornings it is sharp and sudden. Other mornings it is just a quiet ache you carry around all day without telling anyone. I was sitting at my kitchen table with a coffee going cold beside me, looking at a photograph of June and our daughter Paige that I keep on the counter. Paige was maybe 9 years old in the photo, gap-toothed and sunburned, holding up a pickerel she had caught off the dock at the cottage. June was laughing beside her, one hand on Paige's shoulder, looking like the happiest person on earth. The cottage, 3 acres on a lake near Haliburton, 2 hours north of the city. June and I bought it the year Paige was born. We spent every summer there for 30 years, every Thanksgiving, every long weekend we could manage. It was the place where we buried June's ashes. In a small garden she planted herself along the water's edge. When June died, keeping that cottage going was the one thing that made me feel close to her. My phone was sitting face up on the table, and I watched it light up with Paige's name. I figured she was calling about the weekend. Every year since June passed, the 3 of us, me, Paige, and her husband Darren, would go up to Haliburton the last weekend of October to close the cottage for winter, drain the pipes, cover the furniture, bring in the dock. We would make a fire, open a bottle of wine, and spend the night telling stories about June. It was the one tradition I held onto. Instead of calling, she had sent a text. I read it twice. "Dad, we've decided the cottage closing weekend is just for immediate family. Lorraine thinks it's better that way." Lorraine, that name, Darren's mother. A woman I had met perhaps a dozen times since my daughter married her son 6 years ago. A woman who made a point of mentioning her condominium in Kelowna at every single gathering, who had once asked me at Christmas dinner whether I had considered downsizing and freeing up some capital. I set the phone down. The coffee had gone completely cold. I need to give you some background so you understand exactly what I was reading in that message. The cottage was not Darren's family cottage. It was not a shared property. It had nothing to do with the Kellerman family. I owned it outright. I had paid off the mortgage in full years before June became sick. The annual property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the dock repairs, the new water heater I had put in just that past spring, all of it came out of my account. When Paige and Darren got married, I offered to let them use the cottage whenever they wanted. I gave Paige a key. I paid for the new mattresses in the main bedroom, because Darren mentioned once that his back bothered him. I stocked the pantry before their visits. I mowed the lawn when I knew they were coming up. Lorraine had never so much as mailed a card on June's birthday, and now my daughter was sending me a text at 9 in the morning to tell me that Darren's mother had decided I was not welcome at my own property. I sat with that for a long time. Then I called Paige. The phone rang 4 times before she picked up. Her voice was careful in that way it gets when she has already rehearsed the conversation. "Dad." "Good morning," I said. I kept my voice level. I had spent 40 years managing job sites and difficult contractors. I know what it means to stay calm when everything inside you wants to blow. "I figured you'd call," she said. "Walk me through this," I said. "What exactly is happening?" She let out a long breath. "Darren and I have been talking, and honestly, the closing weekend has started to feel a little, I don't know, heavy. For Darren, he finds it hard to be there because it's so focused on Mom, and Lorraine thought it might be good for him to have that space without. She paused. Without it being so emotional. I did not say anything right away. I let the silence sit. Darren finds it hard, I repeated. He does. Paige, that cottage is where your mother's ashes are. That garden by the water. You understand that? I know, Dad. And Lorraine decided this. There was a pause. She suggested it, yes. She thought it might help Darren process things better if it was just us. His family. I closed my eyes. I want to be fair to my daughter, because she is not a bad person. But she had been married to Darren for 6 years, and somewhere in those 6 years she had started using his vocabulary. Seeing through his lens, measuring her relationships through the filter of what Lorraine approved of. She had not done it all at once. It had been gradual, quiet, the way a house settles into soft ground. His family, I said. Dad, please don't make this bigger than it is. I told her I understood. I told her to have a good weekend. I told her to give my regards to Darren. And then I ended the call and sat in that kitchen for a very long time. I am not a man who makes decisions when he is angry. That is something June used to say about me, half as a compliment and half as an exasperation. She said I could go cold and quiet in a crisis in a way that scared her sometimes. But that Sunday morning, I was not cold and I was not quiet inside. I was something I can only describe as clear-headed in a way I had not felt in years. Because it was not just the text message. The text message was just the moment the fog lifted. I thought about the last 3 years. I thought about the way Darren had started referring to the cottage as the family property in casual conversation. I thought about the time he had asked me, twice, whether I had done any estate planning lately, and whether Paige was named in my will. I thought about the way Lorraine had pulled Paige aside at Thanksgiving and spent 20 minutes talking to her in low voices, and how Paige had been strange and distant for the rest of the day. I thought about the conversation I had overheard in the cottage kitchen the previous summer, when I had come in from the dock, and Darren had not heard me come through the door. He had been on the phone. I had caught only a few sentences before I stepped back outside. She's already signed the POA over to Paige. We just need to make sure the property is in the trust before he decides to change anything. I had told myself I had misheard, that it was a different conversation, that I was being paranoid. Standing in my kitchen that Sunday, holding my cold coffee, I understood that I had not been paranoid at all. I picked up my phone and called my lawyer. Her name is Deborah Marsh, and she has been my solicitor for over 20 years. She handled the conveyancing when June and I bought the cottage, and she handled June's estate when she passed. Deborah is not a warm person in a social sense. She does not do small talk, but she is meticulous and loyal, and when I explained what I had heard last summer and what my daughter had texted me that morning, she did not interrupt once. When I finished, there was a pause. Roger, she said, I need you to come in first thing tomorrow morning. That bad? I don't know yet, but I need to look at the POA documents, and I need to see the current title on the cottage, and I need you to tell me everything you remember about that phone call. I was in her office on King Street at 8:30 Monday morning. What Deborah found took the better part of 2 hours to fully lay out. The power of attorney that June and I had drawn up years ago, back when she was first diagnosed, a standard document, giving Paige the authority to manage my affairs if I became incapacitated, had been quietly amended. I had signed the amendment. I remembered signing it. Paige had brought the papers to me at the house about 8 months after June's funeral, and I had been in a fog of grief that I would not wish on anyone, and she had told me it was just an administrative update, some language the notary had suggested. I had signed without reading closely. The amendment had added Darren as a co-attorney. It had also broadened the triggering conditions. The original document required 2 physicians to certify incapacity before the POA could be activated. The amended version required only 1 physician and a statutory declaration from the attorney. Deborah set the papers down on her desk and looked at me over her reading glasses. They would need a doctor willing to sign off, she said. But this makes it considerably easier than it should be. I thought about the $9,000 I had transferred to Paige 6 months ago when she told me her car needed major work. I thought about the check I had written to Darren's brother for a fence installation that had never actually been installed. Small amounts. Nothing dramatic, but consistent, patient, quiet. The same way the POA amendment had been quiet. Can it be revoked? I asked. Immediately, Deborah said. You have capacity right now, which is unambiguous, and you have every right to revoke it and appoint a completely independent attorney. I would also strongly recommend we look at the cottage title today. The cottage was held in my name alone. I had resisted putting it in a family trust years ago because June had thought it was unnecessary. That stubbornness, it turned out, had protected me. If we transfer the title into a properly structured trust today, Deborah said, one where you retain sole control, and where any disposition requires your written consent and the countersignature of an independent trustee, they cannot touch it. Even if someone filed for emergency guardianship and it went to court, the trust structure would be an obstacle they could not easily move. Do it, I said. I'll also need you to update your will this week, she said. And I want you to see your GP and have a full cognitive assessment on file. Dated this week. It creates a contemporaneous record. I looked at her. You think they were planning to go after my capacity? She did not soften it. Based on the POA amendment and what you overheard, yes, I think they were building toward it. The closing weekend exclusion may have been part of that, manufacturing evidence of isolation or erratic behavior. I drove home in silence. I want to be precise about what I felt, because it was not rage. It was something colder and more permanent than rage. It was the feeling of a man who has spent 67 years trying to do right by the people he loves, sitting understanding that the people he loved most had looked at his grief and his generosity and his loneliness and seen an opportunity. That afternoon, I called my GP and booked the earliest available appointment. I called my financial advisor and told him to remove Paige as the beneficiary on 2 of my investment accounts and replace her with a charitable foundation until I could sort out the details. I called the bank and removed Paige as the secondary account holder on the joint account we had set up when June was ill, and then I called the property management company I had used for summer rentals years ago. The man I spoke to, a fellow named Craig I had worked with before, confirmed that a lakefront property in that area would rent very easily, and that if I wanted to list it on a short-term vacation platform, he could have it generating income within 10 days. I told him I was thinking of something more permanent. The closing weekend came and went. I was not at the cottage. I was in Victoria, visiting an old friend from my roofing days who had retired out there. The weather was remarkable for late October. I sat on his back porch and watched the ocean and felt something I had not felt in a long time. Paige texted me Friday evening to say they had arrived safely. She sent a photo of the dock in the fading light. She had no idea that the property she was photographing had been transferred out of her reach 4 days earlier, or that the power of attorney she and Darren had so carefully engineered was now a revoked document sitting in a file at Deborah's office. She had no idea that while she was draining the water pipes in a cottage she expected to inherit, I had already put it on the market. I accepted an offer on the Monday after they left. The buyers were a young couple from Barrie. They had a daughter who was 5 years old. They were exactly the kind of people June would have wanted sitting on that dock. I told them about the garden by the water, what was planted there, why it mattered. The woman cried a little. I did not, though I was closer to it than I expected. The sale closed in 32 days. Paige did not know until the week before closing, when the real estate lawyer's office sent a standard notification to the property address. She called me within 10 minutes. I let it ring. She called. Again and again. I was sitting in Deborah's office when the third call came in, reviewing the final closing documents. Deborah raised an eyebrow. I silenced the phone and finished signing. When I finally called Paige back that evening, I was at home. I had made myself a proper dinner for the first time in weeks. There was a glass of wine on the table. I sat down before I dialed. She answered before the first ring had finished. Dad, what is going on? Her voice was tight and fractured in a way I had not heard since she was a teenager. There's a real estate sign at the end of the driveway. Someone called from a lawyer's office. What have you done? I sold the cottage, I said. The silence was absolute. You can't do that. That's our family's property. That's where Mum is. Your mother's memory is not in a piece of real estate, Paige. I moved her garden. A friend helped me transplant everything to a garden at my house before the sale closed. She's here with me. You moved it without telling me? I did. Dad, that is not, you cannot just. Her voice broke off. I could hear Darren in the background, speaking in a low, urgent voice. Darren wants to talk to you. I don't have anything to say to Darren, I said. Dad, please, we need to. I know about the power of attorney, I said. Silence. I know about the amendment, Darren added. I know he is co-attorney on a document that should never have had his name on it. I know what the triggering conditions were changed to say. I know about the physician Lorraine introduced you to at her church 2 years ago, who has never once examined me. And I know what Darren said on the phone at the cottage last summer, because I was standing 6 feet away. The silence on the other end was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Paige said nothing, not a word. I don't have dementia, I said. I had a full cognitive assessment done 2 weeks ago. My GP called it the cleanest set of results she had seen from a man my age in years. That assessment is dated and on file. My solicitor has a copy. So does my physician. And so does the elder law unit at the Hamilton Police Service, because Deborah filed a report last week. I heard Darren's voice spike in the background. I heard something that might have been a chair. I spent 40 years working to give you a good life, I said. I sat beside your mother while she died, and I kept going because you were still here. I kept the cottage for you. I kept the traditions for you. I kept going, Paige. My voice was steady. I had practiced staying steady. But what you and Darren built together, whatever you were planning, I am not going to absorb that quietly and pretend it did not happen. The POA has been revoked and replaced with an independent attorney. My will has been rewritten. Your name has been removed from my financial accounts, and the cottage is no longer mine to give or yours to take because it belongs to someone else now. Dad, her voice has collapsed into something small. Dad, please, I hope you find your way through this, I said. I genuinely do, but I am not going to be the person who hands you the tools for that. I ended the call. I sat at the kitchen table for a while after that, in the quiet. The garden was visible through the back window, November bare but still there. The transplanted perennials June had grown for 20 years now, tucked into the soil along my fence line. In the spring they would come back. They always did. Lorraine called twice the following week. I did not answer. She left a voicemail that I will not describe in detail, except to say that it confirmed everything Deborah had suspected about her involvement. Deborah's office received it as evidence. Darren's lawyer sent a letter suggesting that the property sale might be subject to challenge on the basis of undue influence. Deborah wrote back in 2 sentences. The challenge went nowhere. I heard through a mutual friend that Paige and Darren had been counting on the cottage equity as part of a financial plan they had been building for several years, that without it, a renovation loan they had taken out was going to be difficult to manage. I felt something when I heard that. I will not pretend I did not, but feeling something and being responsible for it are not the same thing. I flew back out to Victoria in December. My friend had a spare room and a wood stove, and he made terrible coffee, and we talked for 3 days straight about things we had not talked about in decades. When I came home, I felt lighter than I had since June died. In January, I received a call from a seniors advocacy organization in Hamilton. Deborah had referred my case to them as an example of what elder financial abuse looks like when it is gradual and quiet and built by people the victim trusts. They asked if I would be willing to speak at a community event. I said yes. The room held about 60 people. Most of them were older, retired, sitting in the same careful stillness I recognized from my own kitchen table on that October morning. I stood at the front, and I told them the whole story. I told them about the text message and the closing weekend and the power of attorney amendment. I told them about the cottage and the garden, and what it had cost me to let go of it. I told them to read every document before they signed it. I told them that grief is a door that some people will try to walk through if you leave it open too long. At the end, a man in the 3rd row raised his hand. He said he had been through something similar. He said he had felt ashamed of it. I told him that was the first thing they counted on. The shame. The idea that a parent who has been deceived by their own child should feel embarrassed rather than clear-eyed. I told him there was nothing to be ashamed of, that loving your family generously and without conditions is not a weakness. It is the best thing a person can do with a life. The shame belongs entirely to the people who look at that love and see something to take." He nodded, and the room was quiet for a moment, in the way a room gets when something true has just been said out loud. I drove home along the lake road as the sun went down. The same drive I had made 1,000 times, with June beside me and Paige in the back seat, everyone arguing about what to have for dinner, the radio on low, the light on the water going gold, and then pink, and then gone. I let myself have that memory, all of it, without cutting it short. Then I drove home, made a pot of tea, and sat in my kitchen with the lights on.